The jury's deliberation on the death penalty for Timothy McVeigh was brief. They took just overnight to think about it and came back on the afternoon of June 13, 1997, with a death sentence. On August 14th, everyone filed into the courtroom one last time. But for the first time since he was arrested more than 2 years earlier, Timothy McVeigh was going to have an opportunity to make a public statement. He decided to return to a quotation from a Supreme Court justice that he had shared many times with his attorneys. McVeigh stepped up to the lectern between the prosecution and defense tables. He spoke in an even tone.
If the court please, I wish to use the words of Justice Brandeis, dissenting in Olmsted, to speak for me. He wrote, "Our government is the potent, the omnipresent teacher. For good or for ill, it teaches the whole people by its example." That's all I have.
Are you prepared for death?
I am. I came to terms with my mortality in the Gulf War. After that, it's not that hard to be, quote, prepared for death.
From inside a maximum security prison, McVeigh granted his only broadcast interview to 60 Minutes. Journalist Ed Bradley asked McVeigh if there was anything he would have done differently in his life.
There are moments, but no one that stands out.
Since he was still appealing the verdict and sentence, McVeigh was advised against taking credit for actually committing the bombing. So McVeigh characteristically used the platform to espouse his political beliefs, in the hopes of reaching like-minded citizens. Bradley asked him for snapshot opinions on a list of American institutions and officials.
ATF, for example, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Bureau.
Should not have law enforcement jurisdiction. Should be taxation agency.
The IRS?
I believe they're an out-of-control agency.
FBI?
Should be reined in.
President Clinton?
I don't hold him in high regard.
In many ways, this interview sounds contemporary. You can hear McVeigh making the same arguments that you hear in the right wing today.
What do you think is the appropriate way for a citizen of this country to express his or her displeasure with the government?
There are many options.
Is violence an acceptable option?
If government is the teacher, violence would be an acceptable option. It appears they use violence as an option all the time.
In October 2023, the Public Religion Research Institute presented American voters with this statement, quote, "Because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country." In the survey, nearly a quarter of Americans agreed, up from 15% in 2021. But among Americans who believe that the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump, support for political violence nears 50%.
Because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength and you have to be strong.
What happened today will be used by the people taking power to justify stripping you of the rights you were born with as an American. We got to this sad, chaotic day for a reason. It is not your fault. It is their fault.
Timothy McVeigh may be dead, but what motivated him is alive and well in the United States.
We have a breach of the Capitol! Breach of the Capitol!
I'm Jeffrey Toobin, and this is Homegrown. Episode 8, The Ashes.
I I did not view him as a violent person. I cannot imagine him walking up to somebody with a machete and beheading them or stabbing them or taking out a gun and shooting them. That is just not my impression of him.
While working on the defense team, Geraldine Merritt spent a lot of time with Timothy McVeigh. She developed a certain fondness for him.
And I think, I will say that had the judge said that he would grant him bond if he could stay at one of the lawyers' houses, I would have volunteered.
After the formal imposition of the death sentence, a helicopter flew McVeigh to the maximum security prison in Florence, Colorado. It was a supermax, reserved for America's most dangerous federal inmates.
It's a very isolated existence. You don't get to talk to any other person ever. You don't even have any kind of window other than this sliver of light. But the lights are on you 24/7. And so you get absolutely no privacy. And he had to be there for a really long time.
The rules at Florence required prisoners to remain in their cells 23 hours a day, with a single hour for recreation in small concrete yards with wire mesh ceilings.
He kept his spirits up through that. I mean, I corresponded with him up until maybe 3 weeks or a month before the actual execution. He never complained.
In Florence, McVeigh devoted much of his time to nursing grievances against his old attorney, Stephen Jones. He discovered that during the trial, Jones had been offered a $600,000 advance for a book. With a new set of lawyers, McVeigh argued to Judge Mach that he deserved a new trial because of Jones' supposed conflict of interest. Mach rejected that argument. Appeals in death penalty cases can often last for a decade or even longer.
The last thing he would have wanted was to spend 40 years on death row. That's really a death penalty. You only come out in a box, either way.
McVeigh weighed the idea of continuing his legal fight, but in the end, he decided on martyrdom. He thought that he had made his point with the bombing, and now he was ready to move on.
He was ready to die. And that, I thought, was sad, but it was his choice. And I think all of us on the defense team at that point respected his choice.
In July 1999, McVeigh was moved to a prison in Terre Haute, Indiana, where the federal government had built a lethal injection chamber.
He was always prepared to get the death penalty. He just didn't want it to be by the feds. He would have rather been executed by the state because he hates the federal government.
Support for the death penalty in this country soared during the Oklahoma City bombing trial. Around 8 in 10 Americans supported the execution of Timothy McVeigh.
Personally, I had not been a major proponent of the death penalty at the time. My work on this changed that a little bit.
Prosecutor Scott Mendeloff.
We knew from our victims that it was exceedingly important to many of them that this not just be a conviction, but that McVeigh be sentenced to death. I can't tell you how many of the victims, people who lost their children, people who lost their parents, people who lost wives, told us that their sense of closure was tied to getting a death sentence for this guy.
McVeigh committed the premeditated murder of 168 people, including 19 children. Now, I used to be a federal prosecutor, and I've also covered the American justice system for decades as a journalist. I think of myself as someone who was opposed to the death penalty, period. One of the many problems with capital punishment in the United States is that most people who are executed are not like Timothy McVeigh. But if you were going to have a death penalty, it's hard to think of someone who deserved it more. By the late 90s, there hadn't been an execution of a federal prisoner since 1963.
I again extend my sympathy to the victims of this assault, an assault on America, and I will not add to their pain.
After George W. Bush became president in 2001, John Ashcroft, his new attorney general, announced that he wanted to resume federal executions, starting with the Oklahoma City bomber.
I will not delay the sentence of a confessed mass murderer.
At that point, McVeigh had been on death row for almost 2 years, and his execution date was set for June 11th.
When his pending execution became known, there was a lot of chatter online about people wanting some of his hair, pieces of his body, that sort of thing.
H. Ellis Armistead was a private investigator hired by McVeigh's appeals team to assist with the final arrangements. He was partly there to make sure that pieces of McVeigh's body and his possessions didn't fall into the wrong hands as relics. The day before the execution, McVeigh was moved to a cell next to the lethal injection chamber.
There was a kind of a flat affect in regards to what was going on around him.
Shortly after midnight, McVeigh received his last meal: 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. At 6:18 a.m., McVeigh was placed in restraints in his cell, and a prison chaplain administered the last rites.
Probably about 20 to 30 minutes prior to the execution, one of the correctional officers came and got me and took me into the execution building, and they had McVeigh in a holding cell by himself. My purpose was to be able to witness that he had not been beaten or mistreated, which he clearly was not. And I said, "Are you okay?" It was very brief. And he nodded and said yes.
McVeigh was then moved to the execution chamber and strapped to a gurney at 6:34 a.m. About 20 minutes later, spectators were allowed to file into the observation area from which they could watch through a one-way mirror. There was space for 10 journalists and a handful of victims' family members. In a conference room in the Oklahoma City airport, about 230 victims' relatives watched via a closed-circuit transmission. The execution protocol called for the application of 3 poisons in succession, and they were each administered in 2-minute intervals. McVeigh was pronounced dead at 7:14 a.m. Prison warden Harley Lappin gave the official announcement.
The court order to execute inmate Timothy James McVeigh has been fulfilled.
You have a smile on your face. How you feeling?
I feel great. I'm so glad he is dead.
Victims' family members gave their reactions to the news media.
That's the way I feel, and I'm sorry if that offends anyone, but he took 168 lives, and 19 of them were children and 3 unborn children. How could I not be glad?
Raymond Washburn, the blind owner of the snack shop inside the Murrah building.
I'm glad that McVeigh is gone. Somebody tried to take my life. They deserve to burn in hell.
From my own personal view, I don't think it's a day of closure.
That day, McVeigh's estranged lawyer, Stephen Jones, was interviewed at the Oklahoma City Memorial.
The system has not finished its work. There are still others who have not been brought to justice that had a role to play in this terrible crime, and I think that the victims should now turn.
And President Bush addressed the nation from the White House.
This morning, the United States of America carried out the severest sentence for the gravest of crimes. The victims of the Oklahoma City bombing have been given not vengeance, but justice. And one young man met the fate he chose for himself 6 years ago.
3 months later, to the day, was September 11th.
Right, oh my God, another plane has just hit another building, flew right into the middle of it, explosion.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended.
Americans' understanding of mass violence transformed overnight, and concerns about the threat of homegrown terrorism evaporated into the air. Soon after the Oklahoma City bombing, a local TV reporter named Jana Davis embraced the story about the Middle Eastern men fleeing the Murrah building in a brown pickup. Davis ran with that angle for years and years. In March 2002, Davis appeared on the then highest-rated show on Fox News, The O'Reilly Factor.
You took this information to the FBI, you told me. What happened?
Well, what happened was they turned me away and refused to take it.
What, really?
Yes, I even took a notary with me and a affidavit. They outrightly refused to take the information.
Davis's information involved a Republican Army guard from Iraq, Terry Nichols' trips to the Philippines, and, oh yes, get this, the bombing was also masterminded by the world's most famous terrorist.
And that information implicated a Middle Eastern terrorist cell funded by Osama bin Laden as assisting Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols in executing the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah building.
After 9/11, Davis's theories gained traction on the far right. Conservative talk radio host Jim Quinn devoted a segment on his show The War Room to the Oklahoma City bombing.
You remember the bombing, and you remember the first day it was being blamed on Islamo-fascists until various organizations, I suppose, like the Council on American Islamic Relations, picked up the phone and called the Democrats, and until the White House decided that, wait a minute, it'd be much better if it'd be a bunch of European white guys who voted Republican in the last election and blew us out.
Jana Davis appeared with more of her theories.
Those Iraqi soldiers have been seen with Tim McVeigh and Terry Nichols during various stages of the plot to blow up the Murrah building. One of those soldiers in particular is Hussein Hassam al-Husseini. He not only matched the FBI's physical description, but the profile sketch of the infamous John Doe, too. Now, witnesses identified...
I was asked by several people, whom I respect, to direct my attention to the Oklahoma City bombing into a possible foreign connection.
In 2005, on the 10th anniversary of the bombing, Dana Rohrabacher, a Republican congressman from California, spoke on the House floor.
That this mass murder of Americans was accomplished by two disgruntled veterans acting alone seems to be the conclusion reached by those in authority. However, there are some unsettling loose ends and unanswered questions that deserve to be considered before joining those affirming the official explanation.
The congressman later produced a report entitled, The Oklahoma City Bombing, Was There a Foreign Connection? Rohrabacher pushed Jana Davis's fanciful work, and she was again booked on Fox News. This was an early example of the right-wing echo chamber in action. Conspiracy theories appeared on the fringe. They were picked up in mainstream conservative media. They were legitimized by right-wing public figures, and they got repeated again and again. And there was a clear political agenda here. Following the 9/11 attacks, the right wing used the war on terror to redefine terrorism as a foreign policy problem and to ignore domestic terrorism. The idea was that radical Islam was the all-consuming threat, not homegrown right-wing extremists.
We're still having this hesitation of calling these violent, ideologically motivated acts terrorism. So, here we are, far removed from McVeigh's trial, and we're still wrestling with these same exact issues.
Daryl Johnson is one of the country's leading domestic terrorism experts. He'd been interested in racist militia groups since he was 11 years old, when he saw the letters KKK etched into a bathroom stall in a Kmart. Johnson's career started in the U.S. Army, where he focused on counterterrorism. In 1999, he took a job at the ATF and helped lead work on violent anti-government extremism. Then, in 2004, he went over to the newly established Department of Homeland Security.
DHS was given this piece of property that had been basically left over from World War II.
The working conditions weren't great. Johnson didn't even have a regular desk. After about a month, he went to find one.
And so we went downstairs with a screwdriver and we walked around this uninhabitable place and found a piece of an executive desk that wasn't all scratched up and moldy, and basically detached it and carried it up these several flights of stairs, plopped it behind my boss, and he turned to me and said, "There you go, Daryl, there's your desk. That's your permanent desk." And I just looked at it like, you gotta be kidding me.
Johnson discovered that his expertise wasn't exactly valued. At DHS, he was one of the only analysts working on domestic terrorism.
I got the distinct impression that they were looking at it as kind of, Daryl is our alibi, that we can't be accused of racial profiling or looking exclusively at Muslim terrorists. We have Daryl now.
Right-wing extremist violence in America has followed a pattern based on the occupant of the White House. Right-wing political rage increased under Clinton and then dropped under George W. Bush. Then, around 2008,
that's when we started seeing the far right reemerging, the second wave, they call it. And that was primarily a result of the unprecedented announcement and election of the first African-American president, Barack Obama, coupled with the downturn in the economy were the two main drivers. We also had returning military vets from Iraq and Afghanistan, much like returning back from Vietnam in the 70s, and how that led to a recruitment boom in the 80s of these far-right groups. We anticipated a similar dynamic happening with all these returning veterans.
Daryl and his small team began drafting their report about a month before the election. Within hours of Barack Obama's victory, there was an arson attack on a black church in New England.
And so it's kind of a race against time, and meanwhile we're having actual attacks starting to unfold. We're seeing a huge boom in white supremacist groups organizing and rallying. We're seeing militia groups, which we hadn't seen growth from in probably 7 or 8 years, all of a sudden exploding onto the scene again.
The report had the snappy title, Right-Wing Extremism, Current Economic and Political Climate Fueling Resurgence in Radicalization and Recruitment.
Basically, it said that we were going to see a rise in far-right extremism. So it was kind of a warning that we need to start shifting some of our counterterrorism resources, which is limited, onto domestic terrorism rather than solely, or primarily, overwhelmingly focused on international terrorism.
The only American citizen mentioned in the report was Timothy McVeigh.
And he was deceased. There was this, comparison in my 2009 report, hearkening back to what we saw in the early 90s, which led up to the Oklahoma City bombing. So we were trying to set the stage that, hey, we see a cycle repeating itself. We're at the beginning stages of it, but it's ultimately going to culminate into a mass event.
A few days after the report came out, conservative bloggers were tipped about it. That weekend, Johnson was making mulch deliveries for a Boy Scout fundraiser.
I had the radio on in my minivan, and during the lunch hour, they had kind of a news wrap-up, and it was like the second or third story they talked about. And I thought to myself, are they talking about my report?
This Department of Homeland Services report is nothing more than a partisan hit job filled with lies and innuendo.
The reaction on the right was furious.
You can find a lone wolf anywhere with any kind of ideology. That's not a right-wing thing versus a left-wing thing. I don't know where you glean that. Just because it says that in the report, it doesn't make sense to me.
So Monday comes and I get into work and it's like total chaos at 6 a.m.
DHS was inundated with calls, FOIA requests, and potshots from Republican members of Congress.
And so it was just maddening. So I was just running from meeting to meeting, from manager to manager, answering their questions, giving them an overview of what happened, who had seen it, and all this stuff.
Conservative media latched onto one particular aspect of the report, the claim that a major recruiting ground for right-wing extremism was among people with military backgrounds.
And then, of course, hearkening back to Oklahoma City, both Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols had backgrounds in the military, had fought over in Iraq during the first Gulf War.
Outrage tonight over an intelligence report. Critics say the Department of Homeland Security document unfairly paints military vets as right-wing extremists. And
so I thought it was an important aspect to put in this report. And it was just a very brief, like 2 or 3 sentence statement, but it was under this subtitle that said disgruntled veterans.
Johnson was quickly summoned to a meeting at the top level of DHS, and he wanted to push back.
I just wanted to tell the truth. Put some talking points together and have our media office basically counter these false accusations that were in Fox News and, Rush Limbaugh and people like that. And they totally iced me and didn't want to hear anything about what I had to say. And they're like, nope, we're doing something else. Thank you, Daryl. And so, as this whole thing unfolded, I started seeing the political spin they were putting on it, this, concocted story that this analyst had, put it through the pipeline without the proper vetting, and the offices didn't concur on it, and that it was released prematurely, and all these lies. My whole idealistic bubble of federal work, intelligence work, was busted that day.
The report was accurate, and the threat from right-wing extremists was real. But the Obama administration surrendered without a fight. Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano apologized for the report and withdrew it.
I know that some veterans groups were offended by the fact that veterans were mentioned in this assessment. So I apologize for that offense. It was certainly not intended.
Secretary Napolitano promised that the report would be redone in a, quote, more useful and much more precise fashion. It wasn't. The department cut the number of personnel studying domestic extremism unrelated to Islam, canceled state and local law enforcement briefings, and held up nearly a dozen reports on extremist groups. Daryl Johnson was let go.
And the message was, if you talk about domestic terrorism, and these different politically divisive issues that fuel it and cause these movements to recruit and radicalize and mobilize, you're going to have hell to pay.
Meanwhile, right-wing violence accelerated during the Obama years. You probably haven't heard of most of these plots. I know I hadn't, but the roll call runs into the dozens.
That suicide plane crash out of Austin, Texas, some calling it domestic terrorism.
A tax protester attacks the IRS offices in Austin, Texas.
A man enraged by a bitter tax dispute crashed his single-engine airplane into an office building that was also home to the IRS.
A judge near Atlanta denied bond for 4 accused homegrown terrorists who range in age from 55 to 73.
A Georgia militia plot to poison employees and bomb offices of the ATF and IRS in Atlanta.
Frederick Thomas, Dan Roberts, Ray Adams, and Samuel Crump are accused of plotting to obtain plastic explosives and manufacture the biological toxin ricin.
A shooting rampage aimed at TSA officials at the Los Angeles International Airport. A plot to bomb government buildings in Katy, Texas. A man in New Hampshire tries to buy rockets and grenades to, quote, bring forth the original Constitution.
Good morning, America. Breaking news, deadly church shooting. Tragedy in Charleston. At least 9 people killed overnight.
A white supremacist named Dylan Roof guns down 9 parishioners in a historic black church.
Police say this suspect, a white man in his 20s, walked into the Bible study, sat down with the group, and opened fire.
Roof leaves behind a manifesto that reads like updated McVeigh. Quote, we have no skinheads, no real KKK, no one doing anything but talking on the internet. Well, someone has to have the bravery to take it to the real world, and I guess that has to be me.
It's basically, here we go again.
Daryl Johnson again.
And the body count's getting bigger and bigger, and these mass shootings are becoming more frequent. And, I don't take any satisfaction in knowing that I was right or that I accurately forecasted this. I was just doing my job.
The record is clear about which side of the political spectrum is responsible for this mass violence. According to one study, right-wing extremism was responsible for 76% of all extremist murders in the United States from 2009 to 2019. Yet most of these attacks were explained, if not dismissed, as the work of so-called lone wolves.
Whenever we have a mass shooting that's linked to a white supremacist that either hates black people or hates Latinos, and they go into a Walmart or they go into a black church and kill people, the Justice Department, the prosecutors, even the FBI, many times just come out and say, oh, this is a hate crime, or this is a crazed individual that just snapped. They leave out the political motivation behind it.
In 2022, there was the mass shooting at a supermarket in Buffalo, a mass shooting at a gay bar in Colorado Springs. In 2023, the mass shooting at a Dollar General store in Jacksonville, Florida, all committed by angry right-wing extremists. For years now, we've seen mass shooters almost identical in their methods and ideology. Online manifesto, body armor, AR-style assault rifle. These incidents are all dismissed as the work of lone wolves committing isolated hate crimes. But these acts exist in a movement which didn't die in the wreckage of the Murrah building. McVeigh's brand of right-wing extremism is thriving. I've spent a lot of time now in Oklahoma City, and I've become familiar with the sounds of the Great Plains. Most of the time I live in the noise of New York City, but here in the, quote, heartland, it's just quieter. The place where the Murrah building once stood is in what's called downtown, but often all you hear there is the distinctive sound of the cicada. Cicadas live a significant part of their life cycle underground, in hiding, gestating, growing stronger, hibernating, until they emerge all at once to mate, feast, and generally wreak havoc before disappearing again and leaving behind seas of skeletons and molted shells. Some cicada broods wait for as many as 17 years at a time. When I was last in Oklahoma City, there were no swarming broods, just a handful of unfortunate lone cicadas who maybe woke up too early or too late, sitting in the trees and calling out for an army that may not join them now, but will emerge with a vengeance when the conditions are right. Right-wing extremist violence follows a predictable pattern, falling under Republican presidents, rising under Democratic presidents. That trend, however, was bucked when Donald Trump became president. Far-right groups thrived during his 4 years in the White House.
You will not replace us! I think there's blame on both sides. You will not Proud Boys, stand back and stand by.
The events of January 6, 2021 saw the full flowering of McVeigh's legacy in contemporary politics. There was a wide range of people there that day, but their motivations were clear. The obsession with gun rights. Got a gun! Got a gun, get down! The perceived approval of the Founding Fathers. The belief in the value and legitimacy of violence.
Let's get right to the violence. Let's get right to it. Shoot to kill. See an Antifa? Shoot to kill.
The carnage included 5 deaths, countless injuries, and over 1,000 arrests of people who thought they were doing what Trump wanted them to do. That is, to take your country back. We love Trump! We love Trump! We love Trump! Like McVeigh, the rioters justified their actions with the rhetoric of American patriotism. The yellow Gadsden flag, which flew during the Revolution as well as outside Mike Fortier's mobile home, was a frequent sight in the crowd at the Capitol. They chanted 1776, as if their attempt to overthrow a democracy was comparable to the founders' efforts to create one.
I think that the country started to learn that there are extremist elements in this country that we can't ignore, that strike at the very gut of our country.
In the wake of the Oklahoma City bombing, prosecutor Scott Mendeloff actually felt like America was starting to reckon with domestic terrorism. He doesn't feel that way anymore.
I don't think if January 6th had happened in 1995, people would have walked away from that thinking, oh, that somehow is okay. It's not okay. And I think people have forgotten a lot about that. I don't know whether we're able to get this country to see how this kind of homegrown extremism is a risk. I mean, I really don't. After January 6th, I don't know if that's even possible.
There is some evidence that the Biden administration has learned some lessons.
Too much of what's happening in our country today is not normal. Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans represent an extremism that threatens the very foundations of our republic.
In September 2022, during a primetime speech at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, President Biden spoke of the threat of right-wing extremism with a directness and urgency that exceeded even President Clinton's.
They look at the mob that stormed the United States Capitol on January 6th, brutally attacking law enforcement, not as insurrectionists who placed a dagger at the throat of our democracy, but they look at them as patriots.
Biden made Merrick Garland his attorney general, and Garland displayed the same rhetorical caution as a quarter century earlier. Garland refused to address the subject of January 6th or Trump himself with any specificity, but he did lead an aggressive investigation of the insurrection. Yet there are still events to come that could inspire violence.
Once a person gets to that point where they've crossed that line and they're mobilizing and they've already been radicalized, all they're lacking to conduct a violent attack is a catalyst.
Former DHS analyst Daryl Johnson again.
So Trump's arrest, Trump's conviction, Trump's imprisonment, even if he's pardoned, runs for election and loses, all of that could trigger them to violence. I think one other thing that we need to at least be aware of is, these people have come to a point where they're actually calling for a civil war. They're actually hoping it happens.
At the trial of Timothy McVeigh, prosecutors focused on his desire for a Turner Diaries-style conflagration, a civil war.
We were in the middle of a nuclear civil war, and within the next few days, the fate of the planet would be decided for all time. Now it was either the Jews or the white race, and everyone knew the game was for keeps.
McVeigh's plans for a civil war were put in front of the jury to show how extreme and exotic his views were. But all these years later, some of McVeigh's beliefs are common in the contemporary Republican Party.
If Donald Trump were to be found guilty by a jury, where do you see this going?
Civil war.
No, elections don't work. We know that. We know they don't work.
I think it's a civil war. I truly do.
Really?
Yes, I think that's the only thing that's gonna bring America back together after this election if we lose.
According to a poll in the summer of 2022, 43% of Americans believe it's at least somewhat likely that, quote, there will be a U.S. civil war within the next decade. More than half of Republicans feel that way. And 21% of, quote, strong Republicans believe that a civil war is very likely.
In response to the FBI search at Mar-a-Lago, some Trump supporters have also increased calls for a civil war.
In the immediate aftermath of the Oklahoma City bombing, there was a wave of right-wing violence, then a lull. But the extremists didn't disappear, they simply went underground. Today, thanks to the internet, which McVeigh didn't have, they are now harder to monitor, harder to infiltrate, and harder to gauge whether they're building towards a larger violent act. Daryl Johnson again.
But don't let, the fact that we haven't had another mass event cause you to let your guard down. Because we're in this dangerous period. And there's still, hundreds of thousands of people that support white supremacy. There's still tens of thousands of militia members. There's still millions of people that support white supremacist causes and believe in conspiracy theories that the election was stolen. I don't see this threat abating anytime soon, and even though we do have a national strategy in place, the first of its kind to combat domestic extremism, it's going to take a long time to slow the momentum. This is like a freight train. It's been gaining momentum over the past 14, 15 years. You can't just stop it on a dime. It's going to take time.
Leading authority on the white power movement, Kathleen Belew.
What we see today ranges from sort of a casual embrace of McVeigh by people who are active in white power movement activity now, all the way to sort of a worship of McVeigh by people in the violent underground.
In 2017, Brandon Russell, the leader of a neo-Nazi group called Atomwaffen, was arrested at his home for possession of explosives. There was a framed photograph of McVeigh on his nightstand. 2 years later, the FBI connected a New Jersey man named Richard Tobin to online posts directing others to vandalize synagogues around the country. When confronted by agents, Tobin said he thought it would be, quote, pretty straightforward to fill the back of a truck with barrels like Timothy McVeigh did. In 2020, when a Kansas City man named Timothy Wilson planned to blow up several mosques, a synagogue, and an elementary school with a mostly black student body, he texted an associate, "How did McVeigh do it?"
To some people in the militant right and white power movements, McVeigh is a martyr. He's someone who is seen as having successfully stood up against the tyrannical federal government and someone who was able to die for the movement.
McVeigh himself wanted to be a martyr, so precautions were taken over his remains. In June of 2001, after McVeigh had been pronounced dead, private investigator Ellis Armistead was brought into the execution chamber.
And he was on a gurney, dead. He was put in a body bag.
An empty hearse left the facility as a decoy, and Armistead accompanied the body in a van.
We drove around for probably an hour, stopped at McDonald's drive-thru, and got a drink. McVeigh was in the back. Little did they know.
Armistead was then given the all-clear that it was now safe to go to the funeral home.
We went into where he was going to be cremated. They then cremated him. It took a while. They put his remains in a plastic box, gave them to me. I remember they were still warm at the time.
Before he died, Timothy McVeigh had been planning one final provocation. He asked that his ashes be scattered over the Oklahoma City National Memorial, which had opened the previous year on the site of the Murrah Building. With its 168 chairs representing each person killed in the bombing, and much smaller chairs symbolizing the children, the memorial had already become a haunting landmark. For McVeigh, the bombing had always been a performance, a message to the world. The plan to scatter his ashes there would have given McVeigh a kind of sneering double immortality, for the bombing itself and for his return there for eternity. One of McVeigh's defense attorneys talked him out of the idea, and together they came up with an alternative plan. Ellis Armistead took the box to his office in Denver.
I put his ashes in my evidence locker.
For a time, McVeigh's remains sat next to another box containing the ashes of Eric Harris, one of the two gunmen in the Columbine High School massacre. Armistead worked on that case, too.
They were there for about 6 months until one of the attorneys came and got them, and I have no idea what happened to them.
According to the deal the attorney had struck with McVeigh, there would be no single final resting place. His ashes would be scattered to the winds in the Rocky Mountains, By concluding his journey in this way, McVeigh would be everywhere, where, in a way, he remains. Homegrown Oklahoma City was a USG audio podcast produced by Western Sound in association with Esmail Corp. It's reported, written, and hosted by me, Jeffrey Toobin. Executive producers are Josh Block at USG Audio, Sam Esmail and Chad Hamilton at Esmail Corp., and Western Sound's Ben Adair and Colin McNulty, who is also the editor. Production support from Josh Lalongi at USG Audio. The producer and sound designer is Tyler Hill. The associate producer is Stella Hartman. The producer from Esmail Corp. is Sarah Maddy. Original theme and engineering by Alex McGinnis. Fact-checking by Nicole McNulty and Savannah Wright. Special thanks to Betsy Shepard and Dan Leone. Passages of Timothy McVeigh are read by Chris Cowan. Our gratitude also to the Oklahoma City National Memorial and Museum and to the Briscoe Center at the University of Texas. For more information on this podcast and other podcasts from USG Audio, go to our website, usgaudio.com. And to learn even more, read my book, Homegrown, Timothy McVeigh and the Rise of Right-Wing Extremism.